Before we get into the topic today, I do want to do a little pregame, mention two things before we dive into it. The first is the exception to the rule, or the law eternal, which is something the Buddha refers. We'll be talking about in a little bit. And the exception is this. Ecclesiastes 3 says what? For everything there's a season, turn, right? There's a time to be born, there's a time to die, there's a time to laugh, there's a time to cry, there's a time to hug, there's a time to refrain from embracing, right? So I'm admitting up front before I get into this, because some people might get a little salty as I go through some of this. I'm admitting that there's different levels of growth for all of us, okay? There is a time for some people to be working on this while others working on that. And to say in Ecclesiastes that there's a time for a war, there's a time for peace, okay, that's pretty inclusive, right? So that means there's a time for everything under the sun. And so what we'll be emphasizing here is pretty high end. And some people are going to go, well, that's not right for this reason and that reason. I'm like, okay, take it up with Buddha and Krishna and Jesus, because they're the one that said it. I'm just going to be talking about it to people who I think otherwise are interested in spiritual development. And so this is sort of high-end spiritual development, what I call PhDs. If you're not interested in spirituality, this is probably not a video you want to watch or anything you should be listening to, but it's high-end. And you probably already went through a phase of what we'll be talking about. But that's why some people go, but that's not right. Well, maybe that's the phase you're in. That's fine, okay? Different levels. Now, if we're interested in high-end spirituality, which is what Jesus, Krishna, and Buddha today is certainly bringing, then this is for you. If not, there's a time for everything. Now, Paul in 1 Corinthians 3 backs it up. Backs up what I just said. He said to the people of the church, I could not address you as people who were living by the Spirit, but as people who are still worldly and mere infants in Christ. So he's describing little baby Christ beings. They're still immature, so to speak. And then he says, I gave you milk, not solid food, because you were not ready for it. What does that mean? Babies do get milk, right? Then toddlers, get onto solid food and up and up. Well, spirituality has the same sort of component to it. So there is some milk aspect to it, but then there's a solid food. Well, we're getting a heavy dose of solid food here, okay? With the three prophets that I'm mentioning, they get pretty intense here. And I love this stuff, but it's for people who want to be really, really spiritual and realize how effective it is and why it's end game spirituality, okay? So we're going to be emphasizing a lot of, mostly teaching from Krishna, which I've actually done before, but I wanted to do it again sort of a little more therapeutically. Because of a couple different conversations I've had in the last couple weeks with either friends, family, some clients. And I noticed that some people misunderstand what spirituality is really all about. Or what I said, what is the goal of spirituality? And some people have the idea it's to be the nicest human being you could possibly be. Right? That's what spirituality is. To just love all the other people in the world. Of course, the Miracles, one of my favorite texts to read, describes how that's a trap, if that's what we're doing, and can't get into that now. But why spirituality isn't just about loving other people, because if those people don't raise their spirit, if they don't raise their vibration, if they don't raise their energy, if they don't have a born-again awakening experience, then they stay stuck as people. Just like all of us who are trying to work on what spirituality is. It's not being the best person you can possibly be. It's literally becoming a new creature, one that is beyond the ego, right? You do become the best version of yourself in a way, but it's not from the perspective of the ego. It's coming from a higher perspective, an awakening perspective, which is why I like to call what we're going to be talking about leveling up the word woke, right? Because there's a practical application to the word woke. But I like to say that's a small w in many ways. A lot of that word is about embracing a bunch of other people and embracing unity and physical world things. Like Paul said, worldly, there's nothing wrong with that. But there's a capital W woke, okay? Which levels up, which is what we'll be addressing, okay? So, Krishna emphasizes, and I have two more videos on the channel that address this in one way or another. One is only a minute and a half, it's one of those flashes, and the other one is an hour and a half. It was a long live stream that we had. So I'm going to go in between those two things. And we're going to talk about the concepts that Krishna talks about in the Bhagavad Gita, what he calls the qualities of nature. Okay? And there's three essential qualities of nature. And if you will, there's like phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And it's a wonderful way to conceptualize yourself and other people. Really simple too, elegant in many different ways. But again, Krishna, the qualities of nature are ultimately what control us. So it behooves us to know what those qualities are. Simply put, three different qualities look like this. First quality here, dark inertia. You might call that, or I like to say, bad people, okay? Or the bad ego. Then you have something called passion, which is what you might want to call the good ego. Ego is when you look at people physically, and you look at yourself physically, and you're worried about the world, the physical world. As Jesus said to Peter before Jesus was going to be crucified, "Get behind me, Satan. You're focused on the affairs of man." Well, that's what ego does. It focuses on the affairs of man. That's ego, and you could have bad people there and good people there. And again, I'm doing that in quotes because that could mean a couple different things. But then you have something else called lucidity, which I'm going to call the tamed ego. Some people call it ego death, but I like it as a way to integrate, or as Jesus says in the Bible, to give to Caesar that which is Caesar's, give to God that which is God's. You don't have to kill the ego, but we need to put it in its place. And we've got tons of different teachings on ego, but for our purposes, it's this. If you think you're physical, it's ego. But the awakening experience, the full-on capital W woke, is to be a completely new being altogether. And you still have your ego, but it's now a tamed one. To use other words, dark inertia is when you're asleep. Flat out asleep, okay? You're dead to the spirit. When Jesus rose people from the dead, it wasn't about taking physically dead people and making them physically alive. That's still more ego. He took people's dead spirit and he rose their spirit. That's what it's about. Jesus wasn't interested in great CPR. He wasn't here to make sure that people stayed physically healthy. That's not what it's about. If so, he was a horrible role model. He got killed at age 33, right? That's not what it was about. It was about raising people to this thing called lucidity. And so some people are asleep to the spirit entirely. Others are stirring, okay? They're interested in the process. They're passionate, and they do love other people. And Krishna says that's 1,000 times better than this, okay? And it is, for obvious reasons. But it still ain't this. Because Krishna says this is 1,000 times better than that. See, this is the actual woke experience, the capital W. And there's a lot of qualities that go into that, okay, which we'll be going through. Simply, dark inertia is the I don't care phase. I don't care about nothing, narcissists or psychopaths or people that will hurt you for their pleasure, whatever. The Buddha has the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. And greed, you find that there. Hatred, also anger, which we'll be addressing in a second. And delusion is not understanding the nature of the world. When we're about to explain what controls our behaviors in many different ways. And when we break free from those three poisons, of course we get healthier. Well, lots of people who are in this phase have all of those poisons in them. As such, they don't care. And that's just where they're at. They're dark in that regard. Passion is when people are super interested in the physical world and super interested in correcting the flaws of the world and changing people and things and stuff and all of that and making the world fair. Every one of the prophets, one way or another, described, hey, guess what? The world's already fair. Because you know why? We all have the exact same process going on. In fact, for those of us who have gone through adversities, you're better off, says Jesus. Blessed are the persecuted. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the weak. Why does he say all that stuff? Well, who's way more interested in becoming lucid? Those people, right? Why did he demonstrate not... Remember, Buddha was a millionaire. And he was a prince. And he had tons of money. And he was depressed. Well, he didn't make him feel good. Jesus got himself killed. These were not people who were demonstrating how important it is to be physically rich. Okay? Not at all. What they were doing is saying, listen, there's something going on that's far more important than what's going on physically. And if all we're doing is looking at the world physically, well, that's not spirituality. Spirituality, the actual definition of spirituality is of or pertaining to the non-physical. That's what spirit is, non-physical. So then why are we taking that and investing it into physicality as if that's spirituality? It's not. Now they do merge quite nicely, and that's the most important piece of this. We do want to put this into that. But without lucidity, we're going to be limited, and wait till you hear what Krishna says about some of this stuff. So that's the basic setup for it, right? 3 different levels of being, and over here what Paul was saying about milk versus solid food and all of that. In effect, we all start out on a lower vibrational state, ego, physical focus, that's all of us. That's the place of separation and division. And then we strive towards something higher, the place of spirit. This is a high vibrational state, that's the place of unity. That's where it's fair, because everyone's journeying towards that. All of us are doing this, whether we know it or not. So here's some of Krishna's teachings from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 14, directly addressing this. He starts with, I shall teach you still more of the farthest knowledge one can know. And knowing it, all the sages reach perfection. Matthew 5:48, Jesus says, be perfect. Knowing these truths will help you reach perfection. It is the Christ consciousness to understand these truths. And why the world is fair. Okay? Spiritually fair, physically not. That's one of those things I got to make sure I say in the pregame. I'm not trying to say it's physically fair. Of course it isn't physically fair. But it's spiritually very fair, because everyone can do this and everyone will. So in explaining these, one thing Krishna says about dark inertia, that dark inertia is born of ignorance, as the delusion of every embodied self binds one with negligence and sleep. Okay? That's this phase. And actually some people that are at that phase, they feel just fine. It's just where they're at. But they are, according to Krishna, ignorant, negligent, and sleeping. Passion, he says, passion is born of emotion, born of craving. Remember, craving, that's part of what could be one of the delusions of the poisons, includes the idea of desire and needing to change the physical world somehow. Well, passion is emotional, born of craving. It binds the self to the attachment to action. Now that's key, as we say in a minute, what action really is about. But as we're stuck in the phase of passion, and he uses that word later, stuck. As we're in that phase, we're trying to do things. But we're not lucid yet. So those things aren't especially effective. Lucidity, he says, is untainted, luminous without decay, and it binds you to joy and knowledge. And so this being, of course, has a peacefulness about it for many different reasons. And all three of these things lead to action, which we will do next. What's going on in the world is a battle between these three mental states. Okay? These three states that actually require some level of choice and focus and awareness. Which one do you want to be in? A whole lot of people conflate these two, and they think this is being spiritual because they're trying to change the world, but that's not effective. It's not working. Okay? To change the world, get over here in lucid land. Okay? See how Krishna describes it. When lucidity dominates passion and inertia, it thrives. Likewise, when passion and inertia dominate, they dominate the other two. So I think of it as an arm wrestling match. Put yourself in one of these, wherever you want to put yourself. And even by degree, you could be here, whatever, by degree. But what if you go up with someone who's got more of this than you? Whatever that means. And it's an arm wrestling match. Who's going to win? Krishna says, whichever one that dominates thrives. Whichever one you're working on is going to be the one that wins. Well, there's where, if you call that evil if you want. Well, it'll win if these things are weak. But what happens if we all dive over here into lucid land? What'll happen to the dark inertia? It's going to lose. It behooves us to get over into that space. If you want to change the world, that's how you do it. Not physically, you're going to do it through the energy of things. Oh, this is such a good line. When a man of vision sees nature's qualities as the agent of action and knows what lies beyond, he enters into my being. These things, nature's qualities, are the agents of action. It's also pretty logical. Whichever one of these, that state that you're in, that's how you behave. You're in accordance with that. And so action doesn't come from the level of the ego. It comes from the level of the energy. It comes from the level of the mind. The most effective one by far is lucidity. This one is a mixed bag, and this one, as he says in a minute, heads in the other direction, okay? So to understand part of lucidity and part of the delusion and the poisons is to recognize that you're still not doing anything. He makes like 15 references to this throughout the Gita. You're not doing anything. You're responding in accordance to the way you're perceiving. If you perceive love, as he says, you'll experience the unity. If you perceive unity, you'll experience the love, and you'll attain the infinite spirit. And if you act from that place, way more effective for a lot of different reasons, right? But if you're seeing the division and the separation operating down here, your energy's different, you're going to act in accordance with that. What do we have to do? We have to attain the infinite spirit first. What does Jesus say? Seek first the kingdom of heaven. Seek first that, then all the rest will be added to you. What good is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? I mean, how many more teachings do you need? They're all over. Jesus himself, John 5:19, truly I say to you, the Son can do nothing of his own accord. But he only does what the Father is doing. He said that of himself too. I'm not doing anything. Because he knew he let the Father in. That's lucidity. The Spirit, once that's in you, then you go act. It's the only way to do it. That's if you want to be effective, and by the way, feel joy too. Krishna says, men who are lucid go upward, men of passion stay in between, men of dark inertia caught in vile ways sink low. So yeah, let's get out of that phase. That makes sense. But let's not taste that phase either, okay? Let's stay away from that phase. And if we find ourselves in this phase, let's strive in that direction and not focus so much on this one. And that's the big teaching coming up. What pulls us in that direction is something we have to get past. To get into that phase, well, guess what? We better stay focused over here. Otherwise, we're going to get pulled in that direction and sink low. One who's lucid never wavers, knowing that only qualities are in motion. We think we're doing things, right? Well, these qualities are what are happening. The energy of the world is what is happening. The spirit of the world is what is happening. We're just going with the flow of it. Very Taoist, right? Your body's part of nature. Your mind is something that's experiencing this, and that'll be the last thing that the Buddha talks about. Go with the flow of all of this stuff, as opposed to resisting and saying that something's wrong and all that kind of stuff. You could still say that stuff once you're lucid, because then you see it clearly. Of course that's wrong, but now I have a way to address it. That's a higher energy state. The resolute man is same to his foe and his friends. He's the same. Well, Jesus said the same thing. Jesus says, Matthew 5:46, if you only love those who love you, what reward do you have? Right? We have to love foe and friend equally. Well, there's a challenge, right? Again, this is coming from the spiritual level of things. Love your enemies and your friends. Love everything. Love all your adversities, all of that stuff. And that's the lucid state. Krishna says, one who transcends the qualities of nature shares in the infinite spirit, right? Once you recognize, okay, I get it. I'm going to rise up into this. I'm going to experience this. Guess who's done with nature? Guess who transcends into eternity? Call that the kingdom of heaven or nirvana if you want. Samsara is the battle in Eastern philosophy of going through these things, the journey back and forth through all these phases, right? And the arguing and bickering amongst ourselves of who's right and who's wrong and all that kind of stuff. Guess what? Nature has already figured out who's right and who's wrong. None of us are wrong. How's that? We're all just where we are. And if you want to get out of this place, strive in this direction. Very clear. Krishna says, when one accurately distinguishes between bondage and freedom, his understanding is lucid. Which reminds me of our favorite Camus quote, right? The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. So is it physical bondage or is it a mental, emotional, spiritual bondage? Well, Krishna is clearly saying here it's mental and emotional. Oh yeah, there is physical bondage, but even Apostle Paul was in prison. He said, well, but actually not in prison. I'm with Christ wherever I go, okay? I'm already free. And that was from a guy who was in prison, okay? So, well, guess what? The actual prison is of the mind and of the spirit. And to know, says Krishna, one who can distinguish bondage from freedom, the bondage isn't happening in the flesh. Oh, it does sometimes for sure. Again, remind my pregame comment. There's different phases of this. But if you're near the end of if you fancy yourself that way, I'm a very spiritual being, well then buckle up for this last page, okay? Because as Jesus and Buddha and Krishna all emphasize, there's a really important thing that we have to do. Leading into that, one more thing. The joy of lucidity, says Krishna, lucidity first feels like poison, but in the end it is ambrosia. You know what ambrosia is? It's a delicious taste or an aroma, right? At first, lucidity feels like poison, but in the end it's ambrosia. Passion at first feels like ambrosia, but in the end it is poison. Because we get sucked into the physical world and we're convinced we're right about this or that, but we're not lucid yet. Because again, this last page. Dark inertia, it's the joy of self-delusion, okay? It's the joy of ignorance of your sleep. And there, again, there's plenty of people stuck there. That's fine. I didn't want to say the word stuck. They're just where they're at. Sometimes they're evil, sometimes they're not, whatever. That's where they're at. Don't cast pearls before swine, right? They're not watching this anyways, right? The fact is, the joy of lucidity is a sweet feeling later. Initially, it's really, really, really offensive to the ego. So here we go. I set it up this way on purpose. Anger is a problem. Okay, anger is a big problem. Hatred, one of the poisons, says the Buddha. Buddha has an entire section in the Dhammapada on anger. Jesus, in Matthew 5:21, he says, you've heard it said long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders is subject to judgment. But I tell you that, quote, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And anyone who says, you fool, is in dangers of the fires of hell. Ever call anyone a fool? Be mindful of that, okay? Jesus is saying when you cast judgment, fool, or you're angry with, well, guess what? You are now in the danger of the fire of hell. Now, that's not a literal thing again. That would be more passion and dark inertia. It's not literal. It's an emotional thing that we experience, of course. It's a hellish place we experience when we think the world's not fair, okay? But to embrace the concept of what lucidity is to realize that anger is equated to murder, says Jesus, right? Buddha said, this is in the first five sentences of the Dhammapada, he who abused me, he struck me, he overpowered me, he robbed me. Those who harbor such thoughts do not still their hatred. Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is the law eternal. That thing up top. Now, Ecclesiastes might disagree with them a little bit, just to be clear, because there is a time for hate. It depends on where you're at in your journey. Okay? That's Ecclesiastes. But Buddha, endgame, says, you know what, law eternal, no hate. The only way out of this place is to have no hate, to have no anger. And that's 100% of all of us. See how it's fair? All of us have to drop our hate. All of us have to drop the greed and the selfishness and the desire and the cravings. You know, we have to get past the ego. All of us, 100%. Totally fair. And the Buddha then says, he who checks his rising anger as a charioteer checks a rolling chariot. Now visualize that. A charioteer. The Gita is all about Arjuna in a chariot with Krishna as the charioteer. He who checks his rising anger as a charioteer checks a rolling chariot. Him I call a true charioteer. Others only hold the reins. Now imagine you're driving, you're a charioteer, and you have a chariot, the horse is pulling things along, and you see as the chariot is rolling, you know how to work with that. You know when to pull the reins, just think of just riding a horse too, same thing. You know what to do with those reins to make the horse move. Now, he says, he who checks his anger is a true charioteer. He knows what to do with it. Others only hold the reins. What does that mean? You're just holding the reins? You're going along for the ride. You're not doing anything. You're acting out of anger? Oh, the universe is going to take you somewhere. And you're so filled with your, superiority because you're better than that idiot, for example. Now you just got sucked into it, right? Now, there's no place for hypocrisy for the spiritual person. It has to be lucid. Because if you're a true charioteer, you're holding the reins, you know what to do with these emotional states. But those who don't, and they're just holding on to the reins, imagine if you got a horse and you don't know what to do with it. It's going to take you for the ride. And that's us going through life. The true lucid person, the ride is smooth, right? You can experience the world in all its chaos and it feels smooth. But for the person who's not lucid, buckle up.